Eldridge isn't a place you move to, it's a place you get stuck in, like a fly in a spider web that's been collecting dust for a century. We washed up here when I was 14, my mom and I, after my dad left. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet, simple life. But the quiet in Eldridge isn't peaceful. It's the hollow, breathless quiet of a held breath, of something waiting just out of sight. The town is built on a foundation of silence. I felt it from the very first day. The main road is a single strip of asphalt that seems to apologize for even existing, flanked by storefronts with peeling paint that reveal older, forgotten names underneath. There's a diner, the Red Rooster, where the fluorescent lights hum a weary, incessant tune, and the coffee tastes like burnt memories. Then there's the school, a squat brick building with a single, long hallway that feels more like a tunnel. There's no getting lost at Eldridge High. There's also no hiding. The people, though, they were the masterpiece of the town's wrongness. They were so incredibly, unnervingly nice, not the genuine, warm kindness of a close-knit community. This was something else entirely. It was a brittle, performative kindness, a mask they all wore with practiced ease. Mr. Abernathy, who ran the general store, would greet me by name every time I came in. "Well now, if it isn't Alex," he'd say, his smile a perfect, unmoving crescent. "That cough of yours sounds a lot better than it did last Tuesday." I hadn't even realized he'd been close enough to hear me cough last Tuesday. It wasn't friendly concern. It was surveillance. It was data collection. Conversations would halt for a split second when I entered a room, resuming a beat later, just a little too loud, a little too cheerful. Their eyes would track me as I walked down the street, but the moment I looked back, they'd be inspecting a flower pot or waving to a neighbor across the way. I was a foreign body, an unknown variable in a meticulous, centuries-old equation. I didn't have family buried in the Eldridge Cemetery, a place where the oldest, moss-eaten headstones all seemed to share a disturbingly small cluster of death dates. I didn't understand the seasons of this town, which had nothing to do with spring or fall, but with an unspoken calendar that dictated the mood of the entire populace. I was an anomaly, and I could feel the town's immune system, its quiet, smiling residents constantly pressing in on me, waiting for the right moment to either absorb me or expel me completely. I just never imagined what expelling truly meant. The first time I experienced it, I was 14, and still naive enough to believe in coincidences. It was a Tuesday, in April. I woke up, and the world had been turned off. The usual 7 a.m. sounds, the distant rumble of a pickup truck, the chirping of sparrows, Mrs. Henderson's yappy little dog next door, were gone, replaced with nothing. Not silence, but a void, a pressurized, vacuum-sealed absence of sound that made my ears ache. I looked out my window, and it was a ghost town. Every car was in its driveway. Every window was covered by a drawn curtain. It looked like a photograph, still and lifeless. Probably some weird local holiday, I told myself. When my mom came into my room, she wasn't getting ready for work. She was wearing her housecoat, her face pale. "We're having a quiet day today, Alex," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "Stay away from the windows." She didn't offer an explanation, and the look in her eyes told me not to ask for one. We spent the day in a shared, unspoken house arrest. The next day at school, the silence was broken by an explosion of forced cheerfulness. Everyone was talking a little too fast, laughing a little too hard. It was in my history class that I saw the first concrete proof of the town's conspiracy. On the wall was a large, laminated calendar, the kind teachers use to mark holidays and birthdays. I saw the date, Wednesday, April 24th. But the square before it, the one for the 23rd, wasn't just empty. It didn't exist. The grid line separating the 22nd and the 24th was thick and unbroken. Time, according to the official record of Eldridge High, had simply taken a leap. I raised my hand. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose smile was as fixed and painted as a doll's, called on me. "Yes, Alex." Sorry," I stammered, feeling a dozen pairs of eyes lock onto me. "What happened yesterday? Was it a holiday?" The painted smile didn't falter, but it tightened at the edges. A flicker of something cold and ancient passed through her eyes. She put her chalk down with a delicate click. "Some days are private, Alex. They are days for reflection. For balancing the books, you might say. We don't speak of them. It's better that way." She turned back to the board, and the message was clear: drop it. The other kids stared at me, not with curiosity, but with a kind of pitying horror. I had broken the cardinal rule. I had acknowledged the existence of the void, and they all knew something I didn't: that sometimes the void stares back. From then on, I learned to call it what they called it, if only in my head. The day. The day the town held its breath. The day the calendar bled. By the time I was 16, I had an ally, Josh. His family had moved to Eldridge 2 years after mine, and he was even less suited for the town's oppressive quiet than I was. He was loud, sarcastic, and constitutionally incapable of not poking the bear. He was the only other person who saw the cracks in the town's facade. We'd sit in the back booth of the Red Rooster, drinking terrible milkshakes and trading stories of the latest weirdness. He's the one who nicknamed it Creepsville, USA. He was my anchor to sanity, the one person who confirmed I wasn't imagining it all. That April, on the 22nd, we were walking home from school. The air was thick with that pre-ritual tension, the quiet before the quiet. Josh kicked a rock, a look of defiance on his face. "You know what?" he said, his voice a little too loud. "I'm sick of it. Tomorrow, I'm going to do it. I'm going to walk right down the middle of Main Street at noon and blast music from my phone. See what all the fuss is about." I told him he was an idiot, that he should just lay low like everyone else. "Nah," he grinned. "Someone's got to see what makes the ghosts tick." That was the last thing he ever said to me. After the suffocating stillness of the day, I woke up on the 24th feeling a pit in my stomach. I texted him, "You alive?" No reply. I called him. Straight to a disconnected message. At school, the dread crystallized into sheer terror. His desk, the one next to mine that he'd carved the logo of his favorite band with a compass point, was gone. Not just empty, it had vanished. The floor tiles beneath it were clean, uniform, as if a desk had never been there at all. The very memory of it had been scrubbed from the physical space. I grabbed the arm of a girl who sat in front of us. "Sarah, where's Josh?" I asked, my voice shaking. She looked back at me, her brow furrowed in genuine, unfeigned confusion. "Who?" she asked. Not, "I don't know." Not, "He's probably sick." Just, "Who?" I repeated his name louder this time. "Josh Riley. He sits right there." I pointed at the empty space. The kids around us were starting to stare. Sarah just shook her head slowly, a look of concerned pity on her face, the kind you give someone who is clearly unwell. "I think you're mistaken," she said softly. "No one sat there all year." I felt the floor drop out from under me. They hadn't just gotten rid of him. They had performed a retroactive surgery on the town's collective consciousness, excising him completely.
She was a canceled subscription, a returned item.
That's what I remembered, a quiet girl from the middle school band the year before. She had vanished after the day too. It wasn't random. It was a harvest, a quiet, orderly annual culling. And Josh, with his loud defiance, had just made himself the easiest pick from the crop. The year after Josh vanished was a lesson in paranoia. I became a ghost in my own right, speaking only when spoken to, keeping my eyes down, making myself as small and unnoticeable as possible. I felt the town's gaze on me constantly, a heavy blanket of scrutiny. I wasn't the funny outsider anymore. I was the friend of the boy who was erased. I was contaminated. I jumped at every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside my window. I started locking my bedroom door at night, a futile gesture that felt more like a prayer than a security measure. My senior year was supposed to be about graduation and escape. Instead, it became about survival. Then, last week, survival was taken off the table. I came home from my part-time job at the library, the one place in town that felt remotely safe, its silence born of books instead of fear. I tossed my bag on my bed, and my hand brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. It was lying dead center on my pillow, a stark, foreign object against the faded blue cotton. It wasn't paper, not really. It was a single rectangular sheet of something that felt like dried skin, impossibly thin, yet tough and fibrous. Parchment. It was the color of old ivory, and it was cold to the touch, a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to suck the warmth right out of my fingertips. I lifted it, my heart beginning a frantic, hammering rhythm against my ribs. It smelled ancient. It smelled of things that should not be mixed together. There was the sharp, coppery tang of rust or old blood. Beneath that, the scent of a wood fire that had burned down to nothing but ash and sorrow. And under it all, a damp, earthy smell. The smell of a cellar that has been sealed for generations, of a freshly opened grave. The script was written in an ink the color of a dried scab, a deep, flaking brownish red. It was a beautiful, elegant cursive, but looking at it made my vision swim. There were only 6 words, words that bypassed my brain and were absorbed directly into my soul. 6 words that served as both a death sentence and a final, horrifying explanation for my entire life in this town. You have been prepared. Accept it. I read them again and again. Prepared. The word echoed in the sudden silence of my mind. Prepared how? Was it the strange, feverish flu I had when I was 15 that the town doctor had treated with strange-smelling herbal tonics? Was it the way Mr. Abernathy always insisted I take a free sample of his homemade jerky? Was every conversation, every interaction, every kind gesture a part of this, seasoning? I stumbled back, dropping the parchment. It fluttered to the floor, but it landed face up, the words still staring at me. In a fit of pure animal panic, I grabbed the lighter from my desk and flicked it on, holding the flame to the corner of the sheet. The flame licked at it, but the parchment wouldn't catch. It didn't even blacken. It just repelled the heat as if it were a drop of water. The horror of the message was now compounded by the impossibility of the object that carried it. This wasn't a threat from a person. This was a notice from something else entirely. The abstract dread that had haunted the edges of my life in Eldridge had finally been given a name and a face. And it was mine. The impossible parchment felt hot in my hand, as if it were drawing heat from my own panicked blood. My feet carried me out of my room and down the stairs in a clumsy, stumbling run. The house was quiet, but it was the town's quiet now, a watchful, predatory silence that had invaded my home. I found my mom in the kitchen, her back to me. She was scrubbing a pot at the sink, her movements stiff and methodical, her gaze fixed on the darkening backyard through the window above the facet. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the manicured lawns of Eldridge in hues of orange and bruised purple. It was a beautiful, tranquil scene, and its contrast with the screaming in my head was a physical agony. I slammed the parchment down on the polished kitchen island.
It made a dry, rustling sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking, unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Mom, look at it! What is this?" She didn't turn around for a long moment. I watched her shoulders tense, her scrubbing motions becoming slower, then stopping entirely. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water from the faucet into the pot. Finally, she turned, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the letter, and a transformation occurred that I will see behind my eyes for whatever remains of my life. The tired, gentle face, I knew, dissolved. It was as if a mask of normalcy melted away, revealing a foundation of pure, unadulterated terror that had been there all along. Her skin went ashen, her lips, drained of color, pulled back from her teeth in a grimace of fear. Her eyes weren't looking at the letter anymore. They were looking at me, but with a horrifying, profound pity, as if I was already dead. "Oh, Alex," she breathed, the words barely audible, carried on a ghost of a whisper. Her hand rose, trembling, as if to touch my cheek, but she stopped, her fingers curling into a fist. She couldn't bring herself to touch me. I was already contaminated. Marked. "I was hoping it'd skip you, like it skipped me," she whispered, her voice fracturing. I finally met her gaze, and I saw a storm of ancient guilt in her eyes. The words hit me harder than a physical blow. Skipped her? What did that mean? The implication was a chasm opening at my feet. It meant she knew. She had always known. My entire life here, every meal she'd cooked, every time she tucked me in, it was all layered over this monstrous secret. "What do you mean?" I choked out, a cold rage starting to bloom in my chest, choking the fear. "Who did it take instead of you?" She didn't answer. Her face crumpled. A single choked sob escaped her lips before she clamped her mouth over. She turned and fled from the kitchen, not like a mother, but like a cornered animal. I followed her to the hallway, but she was already at her bedroom door, fumbling with the lock. She slammed it shut just as I reached it. The heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place was the sound of my world ending. I pounded on the door, screaming her name, my questions, my rage. Then, the new sound began. From inside her room, a low, rhythmic sound started to build. It was her voice, but it was not her voice. It was chanting, praying. But the language, it was not of this earth. It was a cascade of guttural stops, long, groaning vowels that sounded like grieving wails, and sharp, sibilant hisses that sounded like snakes in dry grass. It was the language of the parchment, the language of the rot at the heart of this town. I stopped pounding on the door, pressing my ear against the wood. I listened to my mother praying to the thing that was coming to collect me, and I finally understood. I was not her son anymore. I was a debt being paid. I was utterly and completely alone. Alone. The word echoed in the void left by my mother's alien prayer. There was no one to turn to, no one to save me. The town had marked me, and my own family had closed the door. A strange, cold calm settled over me, displacing the hot panic. It was the detached clarity of the condemned. If I was going to be led to the slaughter, I would not go blind. I would look my executioner in the eye. I needed answers, not for salvation, but for the simple, defiant dignity of knowing.
My target was the town records office, a sad, neglected brick building squatting next to the firehouse. It was a place no one ever went, a dusty archive of forgotten deeds and crumbling tax documents. It was the perfect place to bury a secret, I waited until the moon was high and the houses on my street were dark, silent tombs. Slipping out my window, I moved through the shadows, my senses screamingly alert. Every hoot of a distant owl, every skittering sound in the underbrush sounded like a harbinger. The lock on the back door of the records office was old and pathetic. A few minutes of work with a stolen credit card and the tumblers gave way with a sickeningly loud click. I slipped inside, closing the door behind me. The air was thick and stagnant, heavy with the holy trinity of decay, dust, mildew, and time. Moonlight streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating chaotic towers of cardboard boxes and rows of sullen metal filing cabinets. I started pulling open drawers, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. It was all bureaucratic nonsense, zoning permits from the 80s, water bills from the 90s, endless paperwork that chronicled the mundane surface of the town. But I knew the real history. The town's true ledger wouldn't be filed under H for horror. It would be hidden in plain sight. My eyes fell on a rusted cabinet in the far corner, its drawers labeled with things like Public Works and Fire Inspections, the camouflage of boredom. I pulled open the Fire Inspections drawer. It was full of manila folders, just as expected, but one of them, tucked at the very back, was thinner than the rest and felt different, stiff. My fingers, trembling slightly, pulled it out. It wasn't a folder. It was a cover. Inside was a slim, leather-bound book, its cover cracked and featureless with age. It felt ancient. I opened it. The first page was a map, hand-drawn in faded, brownish ink. It was a map of the Black Creek woods that bordered the east side of town. The cartography was old, the landmarks labeled with spidery, archaic script. But it was the center of the map that made my blood run cold. There, in a clearing I never knew existed, was a spiral. It was drawn with obsessive, careful precision, coiling inward like a nautilus shell or a galaxy. It pulled the eye toward its center, and beneath this vortex, two words were written in the same sharp, elegant hand as my letter: the hollowing circle. I turned the page, and the next, and the next. They were lists of names, a single name for each year, followed by the date, April 24. The list went back centuries. 2024, Joshua Riley. 2023, Emily Porter. 1995, Thomas Gable. I kept turning, my light shaking. Then I saw it. A page from 1988. The name listed was Sarah Jenkins, my mother's maiden name. But her name was struck through with a single brutal line of the same brown ink. Beside it, another name was written: Mark Corrigan. My mother hadn't just been skipped. Someone else, some boy I'd never know, had taken her place. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a collaborator in the system that was now coming for me. This book wasn't a record. It was a receipt book for souls. April 24th arrived not with a bang, but with the utter cessation of all sound. The silence I had known my whole life in Eldridge was a pale imitation of this. This was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the world. I didn't move from my room. I sat on my bed. The knowledge from the records office was a cold, dead weight in my gut. I was a name waiting to be entered into a ledger. All day, the silence reigned. No cars, no birds, no life. As dusk fell, the world outside my window turned a deep, bruised indigo. Then darkness. I waited. The hours crawled by. 10, 11. My heart hammered a frantic, syncopated rhythm against the oppressive silence. Then, just after midnight, I saw it. A flicker, a single point of orange light far down the street, then another.
and another. I crawled from my bed to the window, my body moving with a will of its own, and peered through a tiny slit in the blinds. My breath caught in my throat. Down the center of the street, a procession was forming. Dozens of figures, all draped in heavy, dark robes that swallowed the shape of their bodies, and they moved with a slow, synchronized, shuffling gait like a tide of darkness flowing through the town. And they all carried torches, the flames dancing and spitting, casting long, monstrous shadows that writhed against the silent houses. But it was their faces, or their lack of them. Every single person wore a mask. These weren't cheap Halloween masks. They were nightmarish works of folk art, crafted from wood, leather, and bone. I saw a deer, its antlers carved from what looked unsettlingly like yellowed human finger bones. I saw a crow with a long, splintered beak that was parted just enough to reveal tiny, filed points within. There was a stoat, a badger, a fox, its wooden face twisted into a rictus of a human smile, its hollow eyes weeping a thick, black resin that glistened in the torchlight. They were the faces of a forgotten pagan faith, the totems of the hungry god that lived in the woods. The procession moved without a singly spoken word. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic shush-shush of their robed feet on the asphalt and the hungry crackle of the flames. It was hypnotic, terrifying. I recognized the stooped shoulders of Mr. Abernathy, the tall, lanky frame of my history teacher, Mrs. Gable. The entire town was out there, their humanity stripped away and replaced by these monstrous effigies. They were no longer my neighbors. They were priests of a dark faith, and they were marching with grim, silent purpose directly toward the Black Creek woods, directly toward the hollowing circle. Any sane person would have stayed hidden. They would have barricaded the door, huddled in a closet, and prayed for a dawn that might never come. But sanity had left me standing outside my mother's locked door. What took its place was a cold, fatalistic compulsion. I was a character in the final chapter of a story, and I had to see how it ended. I couldn't let them take me from the sterile safety of my room. I had to meet my fate on its own turf. I slipped out the back door, melting into the deep shadows of the hedges that lined my property. My heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of my ribs. The procession was already at the edge of town, a slow, moving river of fire and darkness about to be swallowed by the woods. I followed, keeping to the tree line, my feet making barely a sound on the damp soil. The woods were different at night. The familiar trees I'd seen on hikes now looked like skeletal grasping claws against the star-dusted sky. The air grew thick and cold, carrying the smell of wet earth, rotting leaves, and something else, a faint metallic scent like ozone after a lightning strike. The procession moved along a path that wasn't really a path, but a groove worn into the forest floor by centuries of these midnight marches. I must have followed them for half a mile, my fear a constant, high-pitched ringing in my ears. Then, abruptly, the trees gave way. I found myself at the edge of a clearing. It was a perfect circle, unnaturally so, as if drawn by a compass. The grass within was short and pale, and the air was utterly still. In the center of the clearing, illuminated by the dozens of torches that now encircled it, was the altar. The drawing in the book had not done it justice. It was a monument of bone, larger and more grotesque than I could have imagined. Rib cages, bleached white, formed a macabre latticed base. Legs made of stacked femurs and tibias supported a flat, wide slab constructed from dozens and dozens of human skulls, all facing skyward. Their empty eye sockets seemed to drink the torchlight. Moss and a black, velvety fungus grew in the cracks between them, a testament to their immense age.
The robed figures stood in a silent circle around the altar, their masked faces turned inward, waiting. And standing beside the altar, perfectly calm, hands clasped loosely in front of him, was a boy. He was staring straight ahead, his posture relaxed. The torchlight flickered across his face, and my mind shattered into a million pieces. I knew that face. I shaved it every morning. I knew that faded gray hoodie. It had a small, almost invisible paint stain on the left sleeve from when I'd helped my mom paint the porch 2 summers ago. I knew the nervous way he rubbed his thumb against his forefinger when he was waiting. The boy standing at the altar, the offering prepared for the sacrifice, was me. An exact, perfect, breathing duplicate. He was there, in the circle of fire, while I, the real me, hid in the darkness, my own hand flying to my own face, feeling the familiar contours of my own bones, trying to prove to myself that I still existed at all. I was trapped behind the tree, a spectator to my own execution, my mind a frayed rope threatening to snap. The sight of my double, my replacement, standing so calmly by that obscene altar had short-circuited every rational thought. Was I dreaming? Had I already died and this was some purgatorial theater? My own body felt unreal, a distant vessel I was piloting badly. I pressed my hand against the rough bark of the oak, the splinters digging into my palm, just to feel something, anything to tether myself to reality. And then, the air changed. The frantic, dancing torchlight seemed to steady. The cacophony of crackling flames softened into a low, consistent hum. It was a sound that started beneath the range of my hearing, a vibration that resonated up through the soles of my shoes and into the base of my skull. The very ground beneath me felt alive, thrumming with a deep and ancient power. The masked townsfolk all bowed their heads in unison, as if in deference to a king who had just entered the room. And then it spoke. The voice did not come from a single point. It was not a sound that traveled through the air to my ears. It bloomed from everywhere at once. It was in the groaning of the ancient trees straining against their own weight. It was in the collective rustle of a million unseen leaves. It was in the deep, resonant thrum of the earth itself. It was a voice made of geology and botany, of time and decay. And it was utterly, terrifyingly indifferent. It held no malice, no anger, no pleasure. It was the voice of a natural law, as impersonal and unstoppable as a glacier. The vibration coalesced in my mind, the raw power shaping itself into words I could comprehend, though the sound itself was a groan that vibrated my bones.
Deep, resonant, vibrating. Balance must be restored.
The words were not a threat. They were a statement of cosmic accounting. In that moment, I understood with a clarity that was far more terrifying than any monster could be. This wasn't a cult. Not really. These people weren't evil. They were something far worse. They were powerless. They were groundskeepers for a garden that was sentient, ancient, and hungry. They weren't sacrificing people out of malice. They were pruning a hedge. They were paying a tax levied by the very land they lived on. The disappearances, the silence, the masks, it was all a desperate, terrified attempt to appease a god not of heaven or hell, but of the very soil beneath their feet. And this year, my name was on the balance sheet. The ancient voice, the final confirmation of my doom, should have paralyzed me completely, but it did the opposite. It flipped a switch deep in my brainstem, bypassing all thought, all reason, all despair. It was the primal, animal instinct of prey that has just heard the wolf howl. One word screamed through the static in my mind: run. I pushed off the tree, my legs pumping, my lungs burning. For one glorious, impossible second, I was moving. I was a blur of motion, diving away from the clearing, away from the torchlight, into the welcoming absolute darkness of the deep woods. Freedom was a tangible thing, a cold rush of air against my face. I could almost taste it. And then I couldn't. It wasn't like hitting an invisible wall. It was worse. It was as if the air around me had suddenly solidified into thick, heavy glass. My momentum died instantly. My body held in a state of suspended animation, my right foot planted on the ground, my left leg still raised mid-stride. I was frozen. I strained, my muscles bunching into knots, my tendons screaming in protest. It was like trying to swim through solid rock. I was held fast by a force I couldn't see, an immense, impartial pressure that seemed to emanate from the trees, the ground, the very air. With a horrifying, deliberate slowness, the pressure increased on my planted leg. It began to twist me, turning me back towards the clearing. I felt a sickening pull in my knee, a wet, grinding sensation. And then came the sound, a sound I will hear forever. A muffled, cartilaginous pop. A supernova of white-hot agony erupted in my leg as my knee joint gave way, bending backward at an angle that was hideously, geometrically wrong. A scream tore from my throat, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony. But the forest seemed to drink it up. It barely made it a few feet from my lips before the oppressive silence of the clearing smothered it. Through a haze of pain and tears, I looked back at the procession. They had all turned their masked faces towards me. They didn't move. They didn't gasp. They just watched. Their stillness was the most terrifying part. They were observing a process. My escape attempt, my broken body, my silent scream, it was all part of the liturgy. My struggle wasn't a fight for my life, it was the required part of the ceremony, the final thrashing throes of the offering before it was consecrated. The unseen force released its grip, and I collapsed onto the damp earth, my useless leg twisted beneath me. The pain was a living thing, a fire consuming my senses. I was vaguely aware of the wet soil against my cheek, the smell of decay filling my nostrils. My fight was over. All I could do was lie there, broken in the dirt, and watch. From across the clearing, the figure by the altar, the other me, finally moved. It turned its head, its motion uncannily smooth, like a high-end animatronic. It looked directly at me, its eyes locking onto mine through the darkness. And then it smiled. The smile was the single most horrific thing I have ever witnessed. It wasn't my smile. It held no joy, no cruelty, no emotion at all. It was a placid, empty, serene curving of the lips, the kind of smile you might see on a marble statue of a saint, a look of beatific emptiness. Its eyes, my eyes, did not blink. They just stared, perfect obsidian copies reflecting the torchlight, but with nothing behind them. It was looking at me the way a person might look at a snakeskin they had just shed. Then, with a calm that defied the nightmare scene, the replacement stepped away from the bone altar. It straightened the sleeves of my favorite hoodie and began to walk, not toward me, but toward the path leading back to town. As it approached the circle of masked figures, they parted for it without a word, creating a corridor.
The figure in the horrifying deer mask, the one with antlers of bone-white fingers, reached out and placed a hand on my double shoulder for a moment, a gesture of welcome, of acceptance. My replacement nodded once, a crisp, clean motion.
Its voice, a perfect, chilling mimicry of my own, cut through the night. "It is done," it said. "The balance is kept." It continued its walk out of the clearing, and the townsfolk began to fall in behind it, reforming their silent procession. They began to extinguish their torches as they went, plunging the woods back into darkness, one pool of light at a time. They left me there, a piece of trash discarded after the main event, alone in the growing dark with the monument of bones and the fire in my leg. The last thing I saw before the final torch went out was the back of my own head, walking away to live my life. I don't know how long I lay there in the dark. Time had lost its meaning, dissolving into a singular, eternal moment of pain and cold. I waited for my heart to stop, for the forest creatures to claim me, for an end. But the end never came. Instead, something else began. It started as a tingling numbness, a coolness that seeped up from the damp earth into my back. The fire in my leg began to fade, not because it was healing, but because the very concept of pain was being erased, overwritten by a new sensation. I felt roots. Thin as gossamer, they pushed through the soil and against my skin. They didn't pierce me. They merged with me. I felt them weaving into my flesh, my nerves, my bones, my cells being unraveled and respun into a different kind of life. There was no pain, only a slow, inexorable dissolution. My physical form was becoming mulch. My consciousness was becoming soil. My memories began to fray. My mother's face, the smell of the diner, the sound of Josh's laugh, they became thin and translucent like old photographs left out in the sun. In their place, a new awareness bloomed. I could feel the slow, patient pulse of sap rising in the oaks around me. I could sense the network of mycelium spreading from miles beneath the forest floor, a vast, silent consciousness. I could feel the other whispers already woven into this place, the faint, defiant echo of Josh, the quiet, melancholic hum of the girl from the band, the hundreds of others, all of us notes in a single, ancient, horrifying song. My sense of I is almost gone now. It's a ghost haunting a machine made of wood and earth. But one imperative remains, burned into what's left of me. It is the purpose of the circle. It is the will of the land. It is a constant, rhythmic whisper that is no longer a thought, but a state of being. April 23rd, April 23rd, April 23rd. It's a countdown, a promise. A year from now, when the balance needs to be righted once more, I will be here. I will be the cold dread on the back of some new kid's neck. I will be the voice in the rustling leaves that whisper their name. I wasn't just an offering to be consumed. I was a component being installed. The victim has become part of the trap, and the harvest is forever.